Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? We ride the stories of the West, campfire, truths, trail dust, memories, saloon whispers. Gritty human, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The wind had a bite that found skin under layers, a clean, merciless cold that carried road salt and the smell of old diesel. The truck lot off the interstate was mostly empty. Sodium lights hummed and flickered. A torn billboard at the fence line snapped and rattled like a sheet of tin trying to leave the earth. She was there by the rear wheel of a sun-faded pickup hand clutched against her chest. The bandage was a strip of white t-shirt gone brown at the center. Her face shone with sweat that the wind dried as fast as it formed. She watched the pavement like it might move. Evan Carver pulled in 2 spaces down, trailer brakes hissing. The red triangles of his hazards ticked in silence, matched to the rhythm in his chest. From the passenger seat, Ruby leaned forward until the seatbelt locked. Her small voice was thin in the cab. "Dad, is she okay? We will make sure she has a chance to be." He killed the engine, but not the hazards. He set his palm to the wheel until the static in his fingers jumped and snapped. On the seat beside him lay a navy scarf folded into a square, soft and heavy. He left it where it was. Outside, the cold cupped his ears. His boots scuffed a line of grit that had gathered in the lot's low points. He kept distance a measure of space that said, "This is help, not a demand." He set a red thermos near the rear tire next to a clean roll of gauze and a small bottle of clear liquid. He put them down like offerings. Then he took a step back, then another, until his shadow touched the painted line. The woman's eyes tracked him. She shifted as if to shield the bandaged hand. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice rasped at the edges. "That is good to hear," he said. "The thermos is coffee, the bottle is disinfectant. Gauze is gauze. I don't take favors." "Same." He tipped his chin at the wind. "This is just common sense." Her gaze flicked to the thermos, then back up. The whites of her eyes were glassy. She had a manila envelope tucked under one elbow, the corner gone soft from handling. The flap was taped twice. "I can pay you," she said. "Not why I set them there." He stepped back again and returned to his truck. He opened the driver door and Ruby rolled down her window, breath fogging along the glass until her palm cleared a circle. She watched the woman without blinking. "Dad, her hand looks bad." "It does." He kept his voice quiet. He twisted the radio to the weather band. Static rose and fell like sand poured through wire. A voice insisted through it. "Wind advisory, blowing snow on open stretches. Possible closures north past Buffalo." The billboard snapped again louder, a flat clap that made Ruby start in her seat. He reached for the glove box and pulled out the little camp stove and a canister. The stove clinked against the tailgate when he set it down. A spark turned to blue flame, and he set a dented kettle on top. The steam made a white ribbon. Coffee grounds shook into the metal basket and let go their smell into air that could not hold scent for long. "Are we camping?" Ruby asked. "No, we are being visible." He poured a swallow into the red thermos to warm it, then poured it back into the kettle. The habit was muscle deep. When he glanced toward the other truck, the woman had not moved. The envelope had slid down to her hip. She breathed in shallow pulls that misted in front of her and vanished. The lot's light sketched everything harsh. Her truck's tarp was frayed at the tie-down points. Bungee cords had nicked paint. One of the taillights had a strip of duct tape over a spiderweb crack. Her life was in the bed of that truck under plastic under rope. Evan could tell by the way she kept her body between him and the load. "Want me to say hi, Ruby?" asked, chin up, hair stuck to her jacket zipper. "Not yet." "Is she scary?" "No." "What then?" "She looks like someone who has carried something heavy for a long time." Ruby considered that. In the small mirror, Evan studied his own face. The weather put a red in his cheeks he remembered from other winters on other roads. The navy scarf on the seat beside him seemed to hold warmth, even folded. He did not touch it. He took a clean pack of bandage scissors from the toolbox and set them by the thermos, careful not to crowd what was already there. He went back to his tailgate and set his hands near the flame palms, prickling as they woke. A semi rattled past on the frontage road, a white blur with a blue logo. Snow kicked off its tires, spun into the fence, and became part of the night. It left a hollow behind it. The empty felt louder. "Dad," Ruby said softer now, "can I draw her a picture for Brave?" He nodded. She tugged a pencil from her backpack and a stub of paper with a grocery list on one side. On the blank side, she made a small horse that looked more like a dog, then added a star on its shoulder. She bit her lip while she colored it with a broken yellow crayon. "What is her name?" Ruby asked. "We do not know yet." The woman shifted again. The tape on the envelope caught the lot light and winked. She bent slow as someone twice her age to pick up the thermos. Her fingers shook. The thermos came to her mouth and she drank eyes closed. The breath that followed seemed deeper. "Thank you," she said without looking over. "You are welcome," Evan answered from his tailgate. He heard Ruby exhale as if a held note had ended. He reached for cups. He poured coffee into one, not full, not hot enough to burn, and carried it to the line he had not crossed. He set it down and backed up. "I have blankets in my truck," he said. "If you want one, I have what I need." He accepted the words without argument. The habit of pushing could look like care from the inside and pressure from the outside. He had learned that the long way. A gust came from the north and dragged a plastic bag across the asphalt. It caught on the thermos and flapped there like a fish that had forgotten how to be in air. Evan pinched it free and stuffed it in his pocket. The weather band stuttered again. A new voice cut through, clear enough to understand the important parts. Temperatures dropping faster than forecast. Blowing snow on open rangeland. Bridges and overpasses icy first. He folded his arms and looked up at the clouds moving in sheets. There was a pause in the wind that was not relief but a drawing breath. He knew that shape. The lot lights buzzed and flicked once, then held. A security truck rolled the perimeter and did not stop. The driver waved 2 fingers off the wheel. Evan lifted his hand in return. He looked at the woman one more time. She had her face tilted to the thermos lid, warming her mouth on it between sips. The envelope was back under her elbow, close as a promise or a threat. Ruby pressed the drawing to his sleeve. "Can I give it now?" He nodded. He took the paper from her because the wind would take it. He walked to the line again and set the drawing with the cups. The horse with the star looked stubborn in a good way. "From my kid," he said. The woman looked at the drawing for a long beat. Her mouth moved like she was saying the word without sound. Horse. She tucked the paper into the plastic sleeve of her visor, where people kept proof of insurance and maps they could not throw away. "What is your name?" Evan asked. "Mara," she said. "Mara Quinn." "I am Evan. That is Ruby." Mara's gaze tipped past him to the cab. Ruby lifted her hand, a small wave that shook her whole arm. Mara's mouth softened. That was all. The kettle on the stove began to whisper again. He turned, saw the steam saw, his own breath meet it and vanish. He checked the trailer's straps for movement. He rattled each ratchet out of habit. He could feel the night arriving in full. Ruby closed her window and curled into her jacket like a bird under feathers. In the cab, the navy scarf was a square of night on the seat not yet called for. Outside, the coffee smelled stronger and then thinned in the wind. The billboard at the fence slapped its metal ribs and fell quiet like it had decided to wait. Evan watched Mara's silhouette in the cold light. He watched the way she kept her shoulders squared at a world that had not done her any favors. He held his place. The thermos sat between them like a small bright thing that could be shared without more being asked. The wind shifted, the night settled. The stove flame made a low, steady sound, and the red of the hazards kept their silent metronome on the pavement. The lot kept its hard light, and its empty, and the cold came in layers. Evan capped the thermos and set it back by the cups. The little stove burned a steady blue. Ruby had gone quiet in the cab, chin on the window edge, fog turning her breath to cloud that bloomed and faded. Mara held the manila envelope in the crook of her elbow like something that could not touch the ground. Her bad hand pressed close to her ribs. She took another drink from the thermos lid, and the steam climbed her face and left a shine. The weather band hissed and cracked, and then settled on a voice that kept to numbers and place names. Gusts over 40 on the open stretches. Blowing snow near the river cut. Possible chain control north of town. Evan turned it down. The message was already inside him. He knew the particular silence that sits right before a hard thing. Mara pushed from the tire and stood. The motion showed the sway in her knees. She worked the truck door and climbed in. The cab light blinked on and off. The starter churned. The engine caught and then coughed. Her jaw set. She turned the key again. The engine took this time and settled into a thin idle that shook the hood. She tried to rewrap the shirt strip while she sat. The cloth pulled away from her palm with a wet sound. Blood came again, bright and slow, then faster as the air hit it. She swallowed it and kept going. Her breath stuttered out in small pieces. The tape tore from its roll and stuck to itself. She cursed under her breath, and the word was not loud. Evan held the line he had drawn on the asphalt. He watched the way the tape stuck to her sleeve, and the way her shoulders lifted higher than they needed to. He could feel in his own body the urge to cross that distance and make it stop. He did not move. The wind hit the trucks from a new angle. The tarp that covered her bed jumped in a ripple. A tie line snapped. The tarp peeled back and the bed opened like a trunk in a storm. A blue blanket lifted and went. An enamel pot clipped to the tailgate and dropped. A paper map tore free and skittered like a wounded bird. The envelope slid toward the door. Mara grabbed it with her good hand and hugged it to her chest. She lunged out, boots slapping the wet blacktop, and reached for the end of the tarp. The next gust took it from both hands. The tarp bellied and cracked and lifted. It swung over the fence and was gone into the dark beyond the sodium lights. Mara took 2 steps after it, then lost the third. Her knee hit the ground. Her body folded to the side. The envelope stayed pinned under her arm. Her hurt hand hit, and she made a sound that had teeth in it. Ruby was already unbuckled. Evan reached into the cab and touched her shoulder, and she stopped like a bird that hears a branch creak. "Stay in. Hand me the blanket, sweetheart. The thick one." She passed it with both hands, and then the thermos, and then a packet of wipes she found in the door pocket. Evan crossed the lot. The wind rolled cold under his jacket. His eyes watered. He went to his knees beside Mara and felt grit press through the denim. "I have you," he said. "Do not," she said. "Not a favor. Just—" He slid his arm under her back and lifted carefully. She weighed less than he had expected. She kept the envelope against her with a stubbornness that did not leave space for anything else. He carried her to his truck. The blanket went around her shoulders and down to her knees. He set her in the passenger seat and left the door open 3 inches. She held the envelope with both arms now. Her bad hand bled through the old cloth and into the wool. "This door will stay cracked," he said. "If you want out, say it. If you want me to stop, say it." She looked at him and then away like the light in the cab was too bright. She did not answer. Her eyes were glass with fever. Her mouth was pale. Ruby reached over the console and held out her drawing. "This is for you. It is a horse named Star." Mara blinked at it. The paper shook in her hand. She placed it careful between the sun visor and the roof. The corner showed a yellow star on a wobbly shoulder. She put her head back and let her eyes close for 2 beats, then opened them again as if sleep would cost too much. Evan worked fast. He cut the old strip free with the bandage scissors and got a look at the wound. The line across the palm was clean, but deep a frown with angry edges. Red climbed her wrist in thin threads. He poured disinfectant on the gauze, and she hissed, and her whole body braced. He wrapped fresh and tight. He kept his voice simple in the space between each move. "This will sting. Here, breathe like this. Almost done." She had the breath of someone who had been carrying pain for a while. When he nodded that it was secure, she let her shoulders go lower. He set the thermos lid in her lap. She took it and drank like it was medicine. Color came back under her cheekbones and then left again. Outside, the lot changed shape. Blown snow moved low to the ground like a river that had forgotten gravity. The lights lost their edges. The billboard at the fence split one more seam and slammed its frame. A buzz rolled through the poles and died. The radio voice came and went with the gusts. "The rest of your things," Evan said. "Do you want me to try to get what is left in the bed?" She moved her head side to side. Her eyes kept fighting to stay open. She pulled the envelope closer. It had a name written on the front in blue ink and a courthouse address in pencil. The tape at the flap was wrinkled and pressed flat again. "What is in there?" Ruby asked from the back seat. "Paper," Mara said. Then she added, "Important." Evan jogged to her truck and grabbed what he could reach without taking his eyes off the dark at the lot edge. The enamel pot, a rolled sweater, a soft pair of work gloves. He left the lost things lost. The cold burned the inside of his nose. He put the rescued pieces in his own bed and cinched the tarp tight. A patrol car slid by on the frontage road lights off windows, white with frost. Evan could taste the snow now. It had a clean metallic before it reached the tongue. He climbed back into the cab and shut the door. Air from the vents pushed warm across their knees, and then the glass. The heater gave a clack and then came fully to life. Mara stared straight ahead at nothing. Her fingers had stopped shaking, but the tremor still ran along her jaw. Her hair had come loose and stuck to the sweat at her temples. The blanket showed a darker patch where the old bandage had bled through. She tried to sit up straighter and winced when the seatbelt cut across her injured arm. Evan loosened the strap an inch and let it lie easier. He hit the wipers and they sketched and smeared, and then found a rhythm that kept up. Snow slanted across the beam of the headlights in hard lines. The lot looked less like a place and more like a moving wall. "We are not safe parked out here," he said. There is a maintenance building on the other side of the frontage. Low concrete green door looks like a garage. It will break the wind. She nodded once small as if each motion cost. Her eyes closed and opened again. Her mouth pressed the smallest yes. Ruby buckled herself. Her hands were tight on the edge of her booster. She looked small inside the big jacket. She did not complain. Evan turned the key. The engine steadied. He checked his mirrors and eased out. The truck rolled over a line of frozen slush that cracked like old glass. He took the dip to the frontage slow. The wind hit the side of the cab and pushed, and he corrected without thinking. The lot fell behind. The lights were a smear. They crossed two ruts and a drift that threw the steering wheel hard. The tires grabbed and let go, and then grabbed again. The radio found a clear word, closure possible at the pass. He turned it down. He followed the low line of a chain-link fence until the fence ended and a squat shape rose out of the weather. The building was close to the ground, a dark block with a chimney that had not seen smoke in a long time. He pulled into the lee of the wall. The wind changed sound at once from a scream to a deep rush. Headlights slid across a metal door and showed a handle the color of old pennies. He set the brake. The cab ticked as heat met cold. Ruby drew her knees up and tucked her chin and watched him. Mara breathed out slow. Her fingers had left prints in the wool from where she held on. The cup in her lap had gone empty and warm. Evan took the thermos and refilled it and capped it and put it back in her hands. He pushed his shoulder against the door to open it. The world outside was white and moving. The scarf lay on the seat folded and waiting. He reached for it and paused. He let his hand drop and felt the cold ask for more skin. Then he stepped down and went to see if the green door would give. The handle was stiff with cold. Evan wrapped his fingers around it and leaned his shoulder in. The green door shivered and then gave an inch. Snow had drifted tight along the threshold. He pushed again and the seal broke with a sound like paper tearing. Air moved stale and dry with a hint of oil and mouse. His phone light cut a narrow tunnel. Inside was a low room of concrete and corrugated wall. Racks held shovels with splintered handles and bright orange flags on thin fiberglass poles. A scatter of pallets leaned in a corner. A steel drum stood under a dented chimney that went through the roof. The drum had a hatch and a short pipe. A stove not pretty, but meant for heat. He wedged the door with his boot and turned back to the truck. The wind hit his face and needles rose in his beard. He blinked until his eyes cleared. "Bring the thermos and the kit," he said. "Stay close to me." Ruby slid across the seat and down into the wind. She tucked her chin and held the red thermos against her chest. The first step made her gasp. The second step set her jaw. He lifted Mara, careful of her arm. She drew in breath at the movement, but did not complain. The envelope lived against her ribs under the blanket. Her forehead was hot under his palm, even in this air. Inside the shed, the wind turned to a rush and then to a low hum. The door sat back into its frame with a hard thud. Evan set Mara on a pallet and dragged another close for Ruby. He put the thermos near their knees and clicked on a second light for the floor. The room showed itself in pieces. A coil of chain in a rusted bin. A calendar from 3 winters back. Duct tape a roll hung from a nail like a gray wreath. He opened the drum stove. A ring of ash the color of old bone lay inside. No smell of mold. Dry meant it might draw. He found a box of folded papers on a shelf. Manuals for plows, a list of call signs, a faded copy of a map with a blue circle around the interstate. He tore the papers into tight twists and set them on the grate. He broke a pallet slat into sticks by stepping on it and listening for the smart crack. When he struck the lighter flame, found the paper and climbed. He fed it slow, then faster as the sticks blackened and went to coals. The chimney took the smoke. The stove sides went from dull to a slow bloom of red. Heat moved in a cautious way as if it did not quite trust the room. Ruby moved closer without being told. She held her hands over the stove and watched her fingers turn pink. A line of hair lifted on her wrist and settled. Evan broke more slats and stacked them beside the drum. He took the kettle from the crate and filled it with a half-inch of water from the jug. It rattled on the stove lid, and then the lid warmed, and the rattle turned to a soft talk. Coffee found the air. Even a little did the work. He poured a cap into the thermos lid and set it in Mara's hands. She swallowed, and color came up in her face, then washed thin again like tide on flat sand. He knelt in front of her and checked the wrap. The gauze had held, but the edges were pink with soak. He pulled the small bottle from the kit and set it aside. He took the other thing from the crate, a short flask that had lived in the bottom of his toolbox since a man at a job had pressed it on him for cold mornings that bit. The label was worn off. He opened it, and the sharp sweet hit his nose and climbed behind his eyes. "The disinfectant first," he said. She nodded. The line of her mouth held steady. He worked the gauze free and peeled back the pad. The cut showed clean and angry. He poured a little clear down the channel, and she stiffened. He put his wrist under her elbow and kept her arm from jerking. He saw her eyes go to the ceiling and stay there until the burn eased. Then he damped fresh gauze with whiskey and let it sit a breath on the wound. She exhaled through her teeth. "You can drink the rest," Ruby said, like a nurse who had seen it in a movie. "It helps." Mara shook her head. "Not yet." Evan wrapped tight, not so tight he would strangle the fingers. He slid his thumb along the back of her hand to check for warmth. The spread of red along her wrist was there, but it had not leaped past the pen line he had drawn in his mind earlier. He set her hand in her lap and covered it with the edge of the blanket. He took the navy scarf from his jacket, the square that had sat on the truck seat, and unfolded it. The wool smelled faintly like cedar and something like clean soap, if you had known it a long time. For warmth, he said. He did not say where it had come from. "I will return it," she said, voice low. "It is a scarf," he said. "It wants work." She let him lay it around her shoulders. The blue made her skin look a little less washed out. She pulled the ends together and held them like a book closed on a page she meant to find again. Ruby leaned her head against Mara's arm and gentle. "Does your hand feel better now? It feels like fire, and then not. It feels like I know it is still there." Outside the shed, the wind found the corners and made the walls sing. The roof creaked as if some animal walked up there. The green door rattled until the latch caught and held. Snow scratched at the threshold. The shed smelled like old metal and now slowly coffee. Evan poured himself a swallow and let it sit on his tongue before he let it go down. He closed his eyes for the count of 3 and saw a laundry line with a blue square on it and a face turned away, hair stuck to a damp cheek. He put the thermos down. He found an old rubber mat and laid it under the pallets. A broom leaned behind the door. He swept a path for his own feet out of habit more than need. He split 2 more pallet slats and fed the drum a measured amount. He did not want the stove to flash and then starve. He wanted steady. Mara's head tipped and then came up again. Her eyes looked bright and far. She pressed the envelope under her elbow tighter. The tape at the flap had a wrinkle he noticed without meaning to. She murmured something Ruby did not catch. "Who is that?" Ruby asked. Mara blinked. "What?" "You said a name." It sounded like Nate. She looked down at her hand, and then at the envelope. Her mouth moved and chose words. "Noah," she said. "My brother." He did not like the cold. He liked the way sunlight fell in the creek. "Hi." She stopped. She swallowed, and found that the next words were not ready. Her eyes filled, and she looked at the stove instead of at him. Ruby held out Star, the drawing tucked in her jacket for warmth. "It is good to say names," she said. "It keeps them from going lonely." Mara took the paper and smoothed the edges that had curled. The yellow star caught the light and looked less like a crayon and more like something that had happened. She propped it against the thermos. The kettle began to murmur again. Evan took it off the lid and set it on the pallet to cool a breath. He checked the stovepipe with his fingers 2 inches from the metal. Heat steady, smoke gone. Good pull. He dug in the crate and found a pair of socks rolled into a ball. Clean thick, the wool kind that did not care about style. He set them near Ruby's boots. She smiled like this was a birthday, even if it was not hers. The radio sat cold in the truck. He stepped to the door and opened it a crack, and the world poured in white and sound. He shut it fast and leaned his forehead against the cool metal a second. He could check later. For now, the quiet of the shed was the better idea. Mara drank another small cup of coffee. Her hands did not shake now. A fever can smooth a person and then rough them again. He watched her breathe at a pace that made sense for a body at rest. He watched Ruby nest into the blanket, eyes sliding, and then closing, and then opening again because she wanted to watch the flame. He gave her his jacket to make a wall against the draft where the door met the frame. He dragged a crate over for his seat and sat with his back to the cooler wall. The drum ticked as metal settled. Heat pushed against his shins. The green paint on the door had a run in it that looked like a river with bends. His hands had stopped aching from the cold. He flexed then, and the joints made small sounds that felt like waking. Mara spoke without looking at him. "You keep distance when you help." "Yes. It is easier like that," she said, for the person being helped. He thought about how many times someone had called what he did an act of pride when it had always felt like a kind of careful. He did not say any of that. He reached for a nail that had been hammered bent and straightened it on the concrete with a slow tap. The sound was soft and regular and filled the space between words. "Thank you," she said. "You are welcome. For not asking questions you do not need." He nodded once. He was good at that kind of thank you. He fed 2 more thin sticks to the drum. Ruby's head dropped to the scarf at Mara's shoulder. The Navy took the weight without a mark. Mara adjusted the blanket to cover both of them. Her hand found the top of Ruby's hair and rested there as if that was where a hand wanted to be at the end of a long day. The clock on Evan's phone rolled a minute forward. The shed took the new time with no change in breath. He looked once at the door to be sure the latch had not crawled back. He set the lighter near the stove in reach. He put the flask back in the crate and the bottle of antiseptic in the kit, so it would not go missing in gray light. The flame held. The kettle cooled. Snow hissed fine at the edge of the door and built a lace that thickened into a white lip. The wind talked around the building in voices that rose and dropped. The scarf showed one pulled thread he had never cut. He left it there. He let the room be as it was warm enough at last to exhale and hear the breath. Light came thin through the seams. The shed had its own breath now. Metal ticked as it cooled, and the drum gave up its last heat in a slow hush. Evan opened his eyes to the green door, and the broom in its corner, and the shape of Ruby curled against the blue scarf on Mara's shoulder. The air smelled like ash and old oil and coffee gone flat. Mara was already awake. Fever sheen had dried. Her hair had a crease from the blanket's edge. The envelope sat under her arm as if it had grown there in the night. "How is your hand?" he asked. "Less fire?" "Still there," she said. He nodded. He checked the wrap. The gauze looked clean at the edge. He pressed the back of her wrist with 2 fingers. Warm, but not hotter. Ruby stirred and blinked and sat up, hair going in every direction. She looked at the stove and then at the scarf and smiled without saying anything. "We will open the door," Evan said. "Slow." He pushed his shoulder to the green and the latch gave. White filled the frame. The wind had gone from howl to a deep drift sound that was almost quiet. Snow had banked up against the threshold and came down in a soft fall when he eased the door wider. Cold walked in and touched everything in turn. Outside, the lot and the frontage had learned a new shape. Drifts worked into curves that made no sense to wheels. The sky had a hard blue at the top and a pale that was not yet sun at the bottom. Evan stepped into it, and his boots sank to mid-shin in a powder that squeaked. Mara came to the door with the blanket around her shoulders and the scarf tucked close. Ruby leaned at her hip and breathed steam. They crossed to the trucks. Evan's tires showed black circles where the wind had scoured. Snow had packed under the trailer and stacked to the bumper. On Mara's pickup, the tarp was gone. The bed was a bowl of crust. A panhandle stuck out like a thin bone. The rear light on the passenger side held a spidered map of cracks. He crouched by the back tire and ran his palm along the sidewall. A clean slice lived there, a bright line through rubber where a piece of fence or a sharp strap hook had done its work. The bead had dropped. The rim sat crooked in its nest. He stood and looked under the bed for the mount of the spare. The cable that held it had iced hard. The winch bolt had a cap of white that would laugh at wrenches in this cold. He could feel his hands going dull even with gloves on. "It will not roll today," he said. Mara did not answer for a long breath. She looked at the tire and the empty bed and the way the snow took everything and made it look like nothing had ever been there. Her jaw worked once. "The envelope," he said softer. "It is still with you." She held it closer. She lifted the flap edge with her thumb and pressed it back down. The tape stuck again. She looked at him then. There was no glass in her gaze now, only a steadiness he had not seen last night. "Red Lodge," she said. "Carbon County Courthouse. Deadline is December 1st. He checked the date on his phone without meaning to. November 15th sat there plain. 2 weeks, he said. Less, she said. The office keeps bankers' hours. She tried to say it like it was nothing. The words had weight anyway. Ruby peered into the pickup bed and found the enamel pot they had saved. She dragged it to the side and held it up. "Found it," she said. Her breath made white lines across the rim. "We will take what we can carry," Evans said. "The rest can wait." Mara nodded once. The yes was not loud, but it was real. She went careful to the cab and pulled from the passenger footwell a small canvas bag with a zipper that stuck. The sound it made was like a stubborn mouth deciding to speak. She put the bag on the seat of Evan's truck and set the envelope on top. The paper made a dry sound. When she turned, her knees dipped. She reached for the doorframe with her good hand and held. He did not move to steady her. He stayed close enough if she asked. Ruby climbed into the back seat and buckled herself in. She tucked her drawing back into the visor and pressed the edge flat. Evan scraped the windshield with a plastic card from his wallet, and his hand went numb to the wrist. Ice lifted in sheets and slid down the glass and broke. He ran the engine until the vents blew real heat. He checked the trailer straps and knocked snow from the headlights. He went back to the shed and broke the last pallet slat into pieces and fed 2 to the drum, then chose against it and let the fire lie. Heat wasted now was heat gone. Mara stood by the green door with the scarf tight around her throat. The Navy made her eyes look darker. "Hospital and Billings first," he said. "Then you decide your next step." Her mouth shaped a line that could have been a smile if the day had been warmer. "Only to Billings," she said. "Only to Billings," he said. He did not say more. He held the door for her and Ruby. He closed the shed behind them, and the latch caught with a final sound. Snow had already started to draw a white lip back across the threshold. In the cab, the heater worked slow magic. The vents gave air that smelled like dust, cooked clean. Ruby put her hands over the flow and made a little tent with her fingers. Mara set the envelope on her lap and kept a palm on it while she buckled. Her breath came steady now. Her skin had color where it had been salt last night. The radio found a voice that belonged to morning, reports of drifts along the frontage, plows working eastbound lanes, bridges icy, advisories in effect. Evan turned it down until the words sat under the hum like a bass string. He pulled them out of the lee and onto the scraped path where tires had already made a choice. The truck climbed the soft edge and slid and then caught. The world opened in pieces as the glass cleared. The fence line ran like a seam across the white. The torn billboard hung quieter now, the new rip like a missing tooth. Mara held on with her knees and shoulders and let her arms drop loose. The scarf's end lifted in the vent air and fell. The wool looked like it remembered a different winter and still agreed to be in this one. "You have people in Red Lodge?" Evan asked. "No," she said. "My brother used to meet me there. Not now." He nodded. He watched the road and the drift lines and the way the light began to speak to the top of the ridge. He could feel the weight of his trailer and the push of crosswind and the way the tires talked up through the column. Ruby leaned forward. "Can I hold the thermos?" "You can," he said. "Do not open it when we are moving." She held it like a small animal that might run if you did not tell it a story. She tapped the dent on its side with a fingernail and listened to the dull ring. Mara looked at the dent and then at him. "You carry that everywhere," she said. "Yes. Why?" "Because a hot thing is sometimes the difference," he said. He did not look away from the road when he said it. She watched his profile a second and then looked down at her hand. The wrap made a neat white that did not match the rest of her. She flexed her fingers and the knuckles rose and fell under the cotton. She looked at the envelope again and smoothed an edge that did not need smoothing. "I will not be a problem for you," she said. "You are a person with a hurt hand and a deadline," he said. "The truck does not mind the weight." She almost smiled for real then. It shifted her whole face. The interstate came into view slow, a gray ribbon lifted out of milk. Plows had passed. Their tracks made tall ridges that glittered. A trooper car sat sideways at an on-ramp and a figure in a thick coat waved traffic into one lane. Evan lifted his palm in thanks as they went by, and the figure lifted a hand in return. Ruby watched the plow in front of them throw a feather of snow that turned to mist and then vanished. She traced a finger along the fog line on the window glass and made a curve that looked like a creek. "We will find coffee that is not from a thermos in Billings," she said to no one in particular. "Maybe," Mara said. Her voice was softer. Evan kept a steady pace that felt like care and not hurry. The truck hummed low. The heater found their feet and their hands and their faces. The scarf sat warm across 2 shoulders when Ruby leaned in for a second. The envelope sat steady on a lap. The radio murmured about exits and mile markers and speeds reduced. They took the lane that led north. The bridge over the river showed black water with white shoulders. The wind met them there in a hard push and then let go. Evan's fingers tightened and softened on the wheel. He let out a breath he had not meant to hold. Mara watched him drive and then looked out at the flat and the fences, and the way the snow made all fences look like they could be stepped over if you wanted it enough. She pulled the scarf closer and closed her eyes for a heartbeat and opened them again. The morning had them now. The road reached forward in a clean line. The interstate smoothed out under new sky. Plows had carved long berms that flashed with mica where the sun touched, and the wind combed the tops until they trailed into veils. Evan held the wheel at a steady quarter turn against the cross current. The heater quit smelling like dust and settled into the warm that softened fingers and made faces feel human again. Ruby kept the red thermos on her knees. She did not open it. She traced the dent with one nail and hummed something without notes. Mara watched the road. The navy scarf breathed as the vent air lifted an end and set it down. She had the envelope against her thigh, where her palm could find its shape without looking. The radio fought with static and then won for a moment. A flat voice named towns and exits and talked about drift lines across open stretches. Then noise again, like paper shaken near the microphone. Evan let it play at a low volume that sat under the tire hum. They passed a ranch gate with a name welded in steel and a row of cottonwoods burdened with white. The river ran black with a narrow shiver of ice along the edges. On the bridge, the wind hit them broadside and made a hand on the cab. Evan breathed out and corrected. Ruby watched the surface run away under them and counted the posts until pavement rose again. A rest area sign came out of the glare with a small pine icon and the word services. Evan gave the indicator and took the off-ramp slow. The lot had been pushed clean by a small plow. A single sedan sat crusted near the building like a rock in a stream. The convenience store had big windows and a sign that said open in a script that remembered summer. Inside there was heat that smelled like fryer oil and coffee and winter coats. A rack near the door held wool socks and pocket warmers. Another had postcards with elk and sky. In the corner, a spinner rack clicked softly as it turned on a motor. It was filled with small wooden animals on strings. Bison, bears, a fox that looked too smooth to be wild. Evan carried the thermos to a pot and topped it off, tipping the pot to catch the last thin pour without burning his fingers. He wiped the lip with a napkin and set a couple of bills on the counter. The clerk had a red nose and a smile that had seen nights like this. She slid the money into the drawer and nodded toward the rack. Good carving on those. Local. Mara stood in front of the spinner, with her hands tucked under the scarf. She watched the bison go by while the motor made its little clock sound. She touched one, and it knocked softly against another. The wood was warm from the lights. "Pick one," she said to Ruby. "For me," Ruby asked. Mara waited a breath. "For you." Ruby reached for a bear stopped and chose the bison with a nick at one ear where the carver had gone too close to the grain. She weighed it in her palm. It had a belly like real weight and a back that fit her fingers. She looked at Evan, then at Mara. "Thank you," she said the words, careful and real. Mara looked at the small price stickers and peeled it off. She folded the paper and slid it into her pocket. On the counter, she laid down the last of a few small bills and counted the coins with her bandaged hand. The clerk made change without looking hard at the wrap. She put the bison in a brown paper bag, even though Ruby had it already. Habit. They sat on a bench that had a sign asking people not to sleep there. They did not sleep. Evan poured a lid full and handed it to Mara. He poured another for himself, then closed the thermos and let Ruby twist the dent again. "You scared of the dark?" Ruby asked, not looking up. Mara watched a snowplow push past the window and leave a ribbon of spray that turned to crystals in air. "I am more afraid of missing my turn," she said. Ruby nodded, like that made sense in a way she could keep. She held the bison up to the window, and the light came through the thin parts. "What is its name?" Mara opened her mouth and then waited. Ruby smiled and filled the pause. "Star," she said, "like the drawing. It can be a bison named Star." Mara moved the knot of the scarf with one finger. "Star," she said, "that works." A driver came in with a face burned by cold and bought a coffee to go. He stood by the door long enough to tell the clerk that the wind was pulling hard near the river and that a trailer had been blown sideways up near the county line. He left a circle of wet around his boots and went out again. Evan tightened a strap that ran from his chest to his ribs, a small motion with no buckle. Mara saw the hand and looked away. She stood, and the blanket fell from her shoulders to her elbows. The bandage had stayed white. The red on her wrist had not climbed. Outside, the air bit clean again. The truck doors sucked shut with a sound that felt like safety. The thermos rode the cup holder like it was made for it. The bison rode the dash on a loop of string and turned slowly with the truck's small motions. The string made a soft whisper against the plastic whenever the cab hit a seam. They took the on-ramp and found their slot between a plow and a cattle truck. The sky had that washed blue that comes after a storm has spent itself. Far to the west, the mountains climbed into a smear of cloud, like something unfinished on purpose. The wind stayed constant, but not cruel. The rhythm set in. Wipers left their arcs and came back. The radio named another town. The heater found its one true sound. Ruby sang under her breath. Evan counted the reflectors between distance markers without choosing to. Mara watched the light move on the berms and turn sharp edges to soft. She had the envelope clasped under both hands now, not tight just there. A tanker in the next lane threw a sheet of powder that folded over their hood and took the world for a beat. Evan did not lift. The truck rode the cushion and came out the other side with a little shudder. Ruby made a small sound that was not fear and not delight. Mara's fingers opened and closed once. She leaned forward. "There is ice near the shade line," she said. "You can see the gray." He nodded. He had seen the gray too. It pleased him that another set of eyes was finding it. The next set of overpasses came with long tongues of shadow, and he felt the tires tell him about it through the column. They stopped again at a fuel station with a low roof and a row of pumps that whistled through their own throats. The hose snapped in his hand where cold had made the rubber jumpy. He watched the numbers climb and caught himself doing the math. He stopped doing the math. He checked the trailer straps and the tarp that now reached tight and hummed like a held note. In the small window, he saw their reflections muddied by frost. 3 faces in a warm square. Mara went inside and came out with a pack of wet wipes and a small roll of medical tape. She had paid with coins that struck the counter like rain. She did not say where she got them. She did not have to. She opened the truck door with her good hand and stowed the supplies under the seat. A man at the next pump wore a blaze orange hat and a jacket with a seed company logo. He pointed a thumb at the plow route and told Evan the eastbound lanes were better than the west. He said nothing about luck. He screwed his cap back on and drove away with his radio turned up loud enough to hear 2 songs at once. Back on the highway, the light flattened and thinned as clouds drew their own curtain. The radio won ground for a while and let a woman read the new news. She said another system had spun faster than the models wanted and might arrive earlier. Her voice did not bend on the word earlier. Evan turned the volume down and left it there. In the side mirror, he could see the line of their tracks pulled to a clean ribbon and then blurred by wind. Ruby wrapped the scarf end around her wrist and then around Mara's, then let it go and watched it fall. She held Star and made it walk the dashboard up over the ridge of the defroster and down to the clean glass near the seal. She gave it a voice that rumbled very low. The voice said it was not scared of open ground because it knew where the herd had gone before. Evan sipped from the thermos when they slowed behind a plow, then passed when the plow took the shoulder. The coffee jacket warmed his palm even when the lid was on. He put the cap back with a small half-turn. The click sat nice in his ear. Mara caught him looking at the scarf where it crossed her collarbone. She reached up and smoothed the pulled thread near the edge. This came from someone, she said. Yes. She looked out the window and waited. He did not say the name. She did not ask it. They let the scarf be what it was. The road dropped into a wide stretch where fields ran far, and the wind wore them down to nothing but a single line of snow fence. For a mile they drove through floating glitter. The light had found a way to live in the air. It washed the dash in pale and made the bison shine along its back. Ruby lifted it toward the light and laughed before she caught herself and went quiet again, as if sound might scare it off. A county truck straddled the median ahead with a man in a yellow vest setting reflective triangles. Evan eased to the left and gave room. The man lifted his hand without looking up from what he was doing. Work had its own prayers and its own blessings. Mara shifted in her seat. The envelope tapped her knee and settled. She adjusted the belt with her good hand and breathed where it lay. She pressed 2 fingers to her wrist where the skin was thin. Her mouth softened when the pulse under skin met her touch and kept to time. They saw the first billboards for bigger stores and then the shape of overpasses that belonged to a city more than a town. The sky had gone the color of a plate stacked on another plate. The traffic thickened not to a crowd but to a kind of company. Evan checked his mirrors and the lane lines and the angle of snow at the edges. The truck moved steady. The trailer talked to him through the hitch in a language he understood. Ruby put Star in the pocket of her jacket and patted the bump. Mara slid the envelope under her coat and closed the zipper part way as if to remind her body that it was not going anywhere. The scarf held a little heat and gave it back slow. The thermos clicked when the truck hit a seam. The radio named a new exit and the sign outside matched it. The day kept on. The road did what roads do straight when it could be bent when it had to, with small lifts and small drops that no one bothered to name. The cab held its warm and the windows held their clear. They drove forward together through air that glittered and then did not. The sign rose out of the pell like a ship block letters on a pole that wore rhyme along its windward side. Last light, the red outline humming the L, stuttering until it held. Evan turned across the plow berm and eased under the canopy. The pumps whistled in their throats. Salt crust crackled under the tires and broke into new white. Inside the cab, the heater breathed on their knees. Mara had the envelope flat under her palm and the navy scarf tucked snug to her throat. Ruby cradled the thermos like a cat. The bison on its string knocked softly against the dash and turned with the truck's small movements. Evan took a beat, then killed the engine, and the world went to a wind and a hum. He pushed the door and stepped into air that smelled like diesel and fried batter. The canopy lights buzzed overhead. A crow sat on the far light bar, feathers puffed bead eyes bright. Snow dust chased itself in circles at his boots. "You two ready?" he asked. Ruby nodded and popped her buckle. Mara set the envelope into the interior pocket of her coat and zipped it to the ribs. She tested the wrap on her hand and set her jaw. The glass door swung into a heat that felt almost soft. A bell made a ding that sounded older than the counter. The place had long coolers, a line of coffee urns, a chalkboard where someone had written chilly all day and drawn a sun with 8 rays. A CB radio crackled from behind the counter and traded call signs. Somewhere a dryer clicked with a slow thump as something heavy turned. Evan went to the coffee station and poured into the thermos until it swallowed a fresh heat. He tightened the lid and wiped the thread with a napkin. The clerk took his money without counting in front of him. Her hair was in a silver braid and her sleeves were rolled to the elbow where the heat met the work. She tipped her chin toward a stack of wool blankets near the door to the shower hallway. "Storm knocked out the pass road last week," she said. "Another system coming down off Beartooth sooner than they like. You all headed north, you keep it tight." "Thank you," he said. He drifted the aisles with a cart and the old habit of looking for what lasts. Wool blanket, not fleece. A pack of chemical hand warmers. A tin of salve that came in a green box with a label that had not changed in 30 years. A roll of gauze big enough you did not run out at the wrong time. A box of bandage pads. A cheap knit cap in a color that might be called navy, though it leaned more to storm. He thought about food and grabbed a sleeve of crackers and a jar of peanut butter and 3 apples that shone under a heat lamp, like they wanted to be better than they were. He stopped at a display and lifted 3 enamel mugs from their hooks. Red, white, blue. His hand steadied on the third. Mara drifted a few feet away, reading price tags like they were a language that had changed since she learned it. She slid 2 small foot-warmer packets into the crook of her elbow and stood in line behind a ranch hand with chaps dusty with salt. When it was her turn, she set the packets down and counted coins from a pocket that kept catching her bandage. The clerk rang them at cost, then glanced at the wrap and added a small roll of tape without comment. "For the kid," the clerk said. "Cold takes toes first." Mara nodded once. The line moved. The sound of a fryer let out a sigh. Ruby found a rack by the counter with hats and gloves and a few bright scarves. She touched everything, then looked back at Evan for the nod. He picked a child-sized pair of knit gloves with grips and little hearts. Ruby threaded her fingers in and looked down at her hands like they belonged to someone braver. Evan paid at the counter. The clerk slid the blanket across the scanner, then the mugs, the salve, the rest. "You buying like you got sense," she said. "You headed through town or past?" "Through for now," he said. She flicked her eyes toward the big window where the sky had leaned toward the color of unrolled steel. "Hustle, then. Light's been blinking off and on since noon. Happens before a front pushes hard." The CB radio punctuated her sentence with a burst of gravel. A voice came up clear enough to make the words stick. "Whiteouts along the county line already. Eastbound open, westbound patchy." The clerk reached and twisted the volume back down to a murmur. They ate in the booth by the window. Chili that steamed crackers that went soft, fast apple slices given to Ruby in small moons so they would last longer. Mara held the mug in both hands between sips and watched the door swing in and out on a tide of red faces and heavy jackets. A man in a highway department coat shook his hood and told the clerk he had never seen ice climb a roadside fence like that. A girl in a purple hoodie dragged a mop and left a clean fan of wet that dried in a heartbeat. "You open when it is bad," Ruby said to the clerk when she passed. "We open when it is Wednesday," the woman said. "The world decides the rest." Mara swallowed a smile. She moved her wrist in the wrap like she was testing it and found a place that did not complain. She looked at the enamel mug and turned it so the red faced her. Evan stacked the empties and wiped the ring his thermos had left. He nodded to the clerk and took the cart outside with one hand steadying Ruby at his hip. The wind under the canopy was less than the open but more than a room. He packed the blankets and the extra into the truck bed and cinched the tarp with the clean ratchet he kept for when things mattered. He set the salve and the bandage box under the seat with the kit. He clipped the 3 enamel mugs on a carabiner that he hung on the net pocket of the door. It looked like a small flag line. His mind did not do that on purpose. Ruby slid along the truck side while she watched her breath turn to mist and then disappear. She held up her hands in the new gloves and curled her fingers. They made a squeak on the vinyl when she touched the seat. Mara stood under the eave near the ice machine where the wind could not quite reach. Her hair had come loose and she tucked it back with her good hand. Evan brought 2 coffees in paper cups and set one in her palm. Heat ran through the cup and into her bandage and then up her arm. "You keep asking what is next," he said. "Let me ask something else. What do you want?" She stared past him to the pump stud where the crow stepped side to side from one boot print to another. The question sat between them and did not move. She lifted the cup and took a small drink. She set it against her cheek and closed one eye at the heat. "I want the thing that does not vanish when the weather changes," she said. "I want to not barter for a ride with something I do not want to give. I want to not owe." He nodded like he had expected those words and not expected them all at once. "I do not keep score," he said. "I look at road and fuel and calories, and I look at people. That is enough math for me." She looked at him, then straight on. The wind made his hair lift just at the widow's peak. His eyes had the color of river water in shade. She had a thought she did not put to words, and it moved through her like a quick heat. She touched the scarf. "This is not mine," she said. "It still helps." He did not tell her where it came from. He watched the pulse in her neck settle under wool. He lifted his own cup. The paper had a small grease mark where his thumb had been earlier. He drank, and the coffee had gone past good and into useful. The canopy lights flickered once in a way that made the air feel thinner. The sign on the pole let out a hum that shivered and stopped and came back. Across the lot, a camper van started and stalled and then started again. The crow launched from the bar and rode a gust to the line of scrub at the edge of the property. Evan held the door for her and Ruby. Inside the cab, warmth held. Ruby wriggled into her seat and buckled with a click that felt like a yes. She tucked Star the Bison into her jacket pocket so the string would not catch on anything. Mara slid in careful and made room for the scarf to sit without pulling. She set her palm to the envelope once and then let it rest against her thigh. The radio found enough signal to make words. A woman read surface temperatures in a tone that would have fit better in summer. She said beartooth. She said advisory. She said earlier than projected. Evan turned the volume down until it was a low thread under the heater's hum. He checked his mirrors. He looked at the sky. He felt the wheel like it was part of his hands and not an object. The truck took the ramp back to the frontage in a smooth curve and found the grove in the snow where another set of tires had thinned the drift. The last light sign fell behind them and kept humming for someone else. Ruby put her gloved hand out into the warm air from the vent and watched the wool lift and fall. She pressed the cuff against the thermos and smiled when it made a tiny clicking sound. Mara set the paper cup into the holder and let the smell touch her again. Evan glanced at the blanket in the rear view where it rode like a folded animal ready to do its single job. They rolled out past the row of semis with their engines ticking in dreams of movement. The highway took them at the pace that made sense. The sky pressed lower over the west. Streetlights along the outer road blinked and held, then blinked again. He adjusted nothing he did not have to. The line of their lane was clean enough. The bison on its string turned once and settled. The scarf held its warmth. The thermos waited in its ring for the next pair of hands. They left the truck stop into a light that had gone flat, the kind that hides edges. The first miles held, then the wind found its teeth. Snow came low across the lanes like smoke. Evan kept a steady hand and let the truck run inside the groove the plows had cut. The radio tried to hold a voice and lost it to a wash of static that sounded like sand pouring through wire. Ruby watched the bison on its string turn, once then stop. She pressed her gloved hands toward the vent and made small tents of wool. Mara sat with the envelope under her coat and the scarf snug at her throat. She watched the shade line where ice begins. She did not speak unless it mattered. The sky shut. One blink, and the world was a white wall that moved. The plow ahead vanished in a swing of powder. Evan lifted his foot a hair. He did not touch the brake. The wind put a hand on the cab. The trailer gave a small sway and asked for attention. He gave it what it needed, and no more. The wipers found snow they could not clear fast enough and wrote their own tired arcs. A shape rose where the frontage should be. Low, concrete chain link. A sign with a state seal iced over and unread. A highway yard. He eased off the travel lane and found ruts someone had made earlier. The truck bumped over hard snow and rolled into a pocket of wind shadow behind a block building. The gust lost half its voice. It still spoke. "Stay put," he said. "I will see if there is a door." He opened his door, and the wind took it hard enough to make his shoulder jolt. Cold hit his face and went into his teeth. He kept one hand on the truck and felt for the ground with his boot. The drift had a crust that held for one step, then broke under the second. He sank to his knee. The low side of the building gave him inches of quiet. He moved along the wall by touch. His breath came hard and turned to ice on the beard at his jaw. There was a big roll-up door set in tracks. The padlock was a lump in a sleeve of ice. He tried a side handle, and it did not give. He walked to the corner and found a personnel door with a metal push bar. He leaned his weight, and the bar moved. The door opened 6 inches and caught on a ridge of snow packed against it. He shoved with his hip. The drift gave with a sound like fabric tearing, and the gap widened enough for a body. He turned back and took a step into something that was not ground. His right boot dropped into a hole and his weight followed. His ankle bent where a joint should not bend. The pain came clean and white. He went to his hands and knees and breathed air that hurt to pull in. He pulled his leg free and pushed snow out of the cuff of his jeans. He tested the ankle, and it answered with hot lightning up the side of his calf. Inside the cab, Ruby had unbuckled and buckled again in the time it took to be scared and then decide. Mara opened her door, and the wind shoved it into her. She wedged her shoulder and slipped out, then turned back to pull the envelope from under her coat and shove it into the glove box. She shut the door and locked it. She moved in the angle the truck gave, head down, scarf tight. Feet feeling for what could hold. Evan tried to stand and went crooked. He reached out and his hand found cinder block. When he looked up, Mara was there. The wind took her hair and left her eyes. She set her good hand to his elbow. He leaned a piece of weight on her, and they moved 3 short steps to the door that had given. He pushed with his shoulder, and she put her hip in, and the gap became entry. The building took them like a cavern, cold but not wind, diesel and dust. In the dim, his phone light turned aisles into short tunnels. A road grader hunched at one bay like an animal asleep. Pallets leaned in stacks. A row of plastic barrels showed sand. There was a steel drum with a short chimney, black with use. A scrap barrel stood beside it, half full of broken slats. The power was out. Emergency lights along the ceiling glowed a stubborn red. "Get Ruby," he said. Mara nodded and went back into the white. She moved by feel till the truck opened the door and scooped Ruby into her coat. The girl's face was hot where it pressed Mara's neck. That heat was wrong for this weather. She ran the 3 steps like the ground was not there, and the door gave again and they fell into the cold quiet. Ruby's breath came fast. Her eyes were glassy. She swallowed and shook and did not cry. She put her hand out for Evan. He took it, and his palm felt fire where it touched her. "You are warm," he said, and heard his own voice steady itself. He set her down by the drum and pushed inside the hatch. Ash ring. Dry. Good enough. He found a box of old manuals and tore the pages into tight twists. He fed them into the belly and pulled scrap from the barrel and made a small teepee that looked like the word heat. Mara kneeled and pulled a lighter from his pocket when he reached. She sparked it, and the flame found paper and rose. It took more work than it should have. Then the wood caught and burned clean. The drum sides turned from dull to a slow glow. The chimney drew. The smell of smoke chased the diesel to the roof. Evan's ankle shouted when he stood. He set his jaw and ignored it. He unrolled a moving blanket from the bed of the truck and brought it inside and set it near the drum. He found a stack of old orange flags on fiberglass poles and pulled the flags off and kept the poles for later. He checked the stovepipe with a hand held close enough to feel draft. Good pull, no leak. Ruby coughed and took a breath like someone just taught her. Mara put a palm to the girl's forehead and pulled it back as if heat could burn skin. She met Evan's eyes, and he saw his own fear there. He got the kit from under the seat and unsnapped it and found the bottle that was always too small. He gave a dose and watched Ruby swallow with her eyes closed. He made a pad of wet wipes and cold water and laid it at her hairline. Mara peeled the scarf from her shoulder and doubled it, then laid it across Ruby's chest. The wool took the heat and gave comfort back. The bison toy came from the jacket pocket and sat in the crook of Ruby's arm. She curled around it. Her breath slowed. Her mouth whispered a name like it had nowhere else to go. "Lena," she said, and then "Mama," and then she quieted. The sound rang in Evan, and everything in him wanted to stand up and fight air. He put a hand on the drum stove to anchor himself and felt heat through steel. He checked the wrap on Mara's hand. Clean at the edge, no new swell. The red line on her wrist had not climbed. The gauze had gone loose at one corner with the work of the door. He tightened it, and she did not flinch. He looked at his ankle. It had already risen in a swell above the boot. Purple would come. He pulled the laces and eased the boot off and set his teeth while he did it. He pulled a sock from the crate and wrapped it above the joint to keep heat in the foot. He tore a strip from the moving blanket's edge and bound the ankle tight in a figure that would hold. Mara watched his hands. "Give me that," she said. She tied the last loop and checked the skin above her knot for color. She tore a strip from the hem of her sweater with her teeth and made a brace over the wrap. It was not pretty. It was firm. He found an old snow shovel handle near the wall and set it as a crutch. He stood on his good leg and took a step and let his weight find the handle. It would do. He went to the door, opened it a crack, and filled a kettle with clean snow from the drift, brought it back, and set it on the drum lid. He let the heat make water and the water make steam, and the steam soften air that had held its hard too long. The radio in the truck still had battery. He pulled it inside and set it on a crate and turned the dial until he found a voice. Static and numbers, then nothing. Then a burst that said county name and nothing else. He set it to low and let the noise be a kind of company. The drum ticked, the building creaked. The wind went around the walls in a tone that changed with what it found. They took turns holding a wet cloth to Ruby's neck and wrists. They loosened her jacket and kept the blanket over her legs. Mara told a story without plot, just names of birds she remembered from a different winter by a different river. Evan cut pallets into sticks with the edge of a flat bar and fed the drum small and often. The kettle clicked and breathed. He poured a little water into the thermos to warm it, then poured it back into the kettle and filled the thermos for later. The smell of coffee found the cold back corners of the room and made it less empty. Time lost its corners. The light outside stayed the same shade of dim. They talked in low voices. They kept their hands busy. They did not name fear out loud. The drum kept its slow glow. At some hour, Ruby's skin burned hotter again. She shivered against heat. She said a few words that did not fit the room. Evan knelt and put his forehead to hers and spoke about a creek they had walked last summer, where minnows flashed like coins, and Ruby had slipped off a rock and laughed in water up to her knees. He said it like someone reading a recipe. His voice did the work his hands could not. Mara set a cool cloth and then another. The small bottle ran low. She tipped it and counted the stubborn drops. She took snow in the kettle and made water, and then cool and then warm as needed. She did not look at the door. She stayed where the work was. Evan stood to get more scrap and put weight wrong. His ankle lit him up, and he grabbed for the shovel handle and missed, and caught the barrel edge. The drum did not tip. He did not fall. He breathed and held and waited for the pain to find a smaller shape. Mara watched his face, and in the set of his mouth, she read a page she knew. "Sit," she said. "Now." He sat. She took the shovel handle and set it near his right hand. She knelt and checked the wrap again. The look she gave him was not permission and not request. It was agreement. He let the relief come into his shoulders like heat. The coffee went from hot to warm to gone. The thermos held one more cap, and then there was an echo in the lid when he tapped it. He set it aside. The radio gave one clear word closure and then slid back into noise. The emergency lights blinked once and held. The drum glowed and dimmed and glowed again with each small feeding. The scrap barrel went low. He counted pieces without thinking and stopped himself from doing it again. Mara moved closer to Ruby and pulled the scarf wide so it covered both their shoulders. The Navy held 2 breaths. Evan reached across and took Mara's free hand where it lay on the blanket. She let him. For a long time they did not move. The skin under her fingers was cold where it met bone and warm where it met his palm. The wind sang a new note around the far corner, and the building answered with a groan that came from deep. Ruby's fever did not break. It did not climb higher. It held like a line on a graph no one wanted to see. She slept in small pieces and woke to drink water and slept again. Her hair stuck in little lines to her forehead, and the wool under her cheek took the sweat and did not complain. The bison sat tucked against her chest, with one ear nicked where the carver had gone close to the grain. It looked stubborn in a way that helped. Evan leaned his head against the cold side of the drum and closed his eyes and saw a hospital room light painted on a wall he did not want to remember. He opened his eyes and was here again. The sound of the stove and the breath of 2 people and the voice of the wind made a pattern. He let it hold him like he was another piece of the room. Mara watched the small rise and fall of Ruby's chest. She watched the pulse at the child's throat and the way it drew to the skin and disappeared. She thought the word home and did not say it. She pressed her palm to Ruby's hand so the girl could find another hand if she reached in the dark. Snow worked under the door in a fine sift and made a white lip along the concrete. Heat licked it, and it melted and ran in a thin line and then froze again where the cold reached. The line looked like a vein drawn across the floor. The emergency lights hummed. The radio hissed. The kettle breathed when the lid wobbled on a small boil, and then stilled. They waited. The room had 3 heartbeats and 1 flame. The scarf held its warmth. The night kept its weather. The sound of wind was a wall, and then a river, and then a sea. They leaned into each other enough to feel that someone else was there, and kept still. Morning arrived in pieces. The wind lost its knife and kept a dull push. The drum stove held a red the color of fruit skin and then let it go. Frost traced the edges of the green door and looked like lace someone had stretched too thin. Evan opened his eyes to the low hum of emergency lights and the kettle lid ticking where heat left metal. Mara shifted against the pallet. The navy scarf lay across her, and Ruby like a small sky. She touched the girl's forehead with 2 fingers. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. Evan moved closer. He pressed his hand to Ruby's cheek, cool enough to keep his breath easy. He felt the small weight of the bison toy in the crook of her arm. One ear was nicked. It made the animal look like it had a story. Ruby blinked. She found the world and then found their faces. Her mouth pulled up. "I could eat," she said. The sound broke something tight in Evan's chest. He laughed once, quiet and short, like a person who had remembered to breathe. He poured water into the thermos to warm it, and then back into the kettle. He made oatmeal from a packet he had forgotten in a toolbox, thin and sweet and hot. Ruby held the enamel mug in both hands and blew on it with great care. Mara took her own spoon, her injured hand held still in her lap. "How is the ankle?" she asked. "It holds," he said. He eased weight onto it. The wrap gave back a hard throb, and then settled to a pain that felt square. The shovel handle he had cut yesterday stood against the wall. He took it and found his balance. The room seemed to accept that he was vertical. Mara unwrapped her bandage a fraction to check like someone peeking at a wound for the first time. The cut was clean. The skin around it was less angry. The red line at her wrist had not climbed. She pressed the gauze back with gentle fingers and retied the end with her teeth. The knot came out neat. The radio in the corner had slept on static. Evan turned the dial slowly. Noise drew back a little. A voice stepped in thin at first and then present. County names. Plows on the eastbound lanes. Visibility improving along the river. Temperatures still low. The voice faded and returned with one word that mattered. Clearing. Mara let her eyes close for one breath. The air in the building changed by a grain. They fed the stove twice and then let it go quiet. The drum ticked as the skin cooled. The emergency lights watched them with their steady red. The door had a white lip where snow had worked in and turned to a shallow ridge of ice. Evan scraped it aside with the heel of his boot, and the sound lit the space like flint. He opened the door a crack. The world beyond was white and still. Wind worked the far fence into a thin song, a metal hum without words. Sky showed itself at last, a pale blue like a bruise that had started to heal. The grater in the bay looked less like an animal asleep and more like a machine waiting its turn. They packed the few things. Blanket rolled, kit snapped shut. The thermos had heat again. The scarf went around 2 shoulders, then slipped back to 1. The envelope came from the glove box and settled under Mara's coat like a heartbeat. Evan looked at her. "We can push to Billings. Hospital first. Then you choose." Mara watched Ruby wipe oatmeal from her lip with the back of a hand too big for such a small face. She watched Evan test his weight without making a sound about it. She set her palm on the envelope, felt the stiff edge under canvas, and looked back at him. "I want to stay," she said. "Not until a door. Not until the weather lets up. I want to come with you past town." His breath went out like he had been holding it for a long piece of night. He did not speak. He let the words settle in the room. He looked at the scarf on her shoulder and then at the way her jaw had lost its iron. He nodded once, then he nodded again. "We will make room," he said. "We already have," Ruby told the bison as if it had asked. They went outside. The white came up to Evan's shins and squeaked the way cold does when it is real. The air in his nose felt like glass. The sun had found a corner of the sky and set the drifts to sparkling. Footprints wrote their own short story from the door to the trucks and back again. They dug where they had to dig and did not where they did not. The plows had thrown a wall along the yard's mouth. Someone had cut through it earlier. The cut had frozen into a slot. Evan walked the path once with the shovel handle as a staff and read the ground with his boot. The ankle sent up messages. He filed them under later. Mara checked her truck. The tire at the rear had settled on the rim and faced the world with a slit. She touched the dent in the taillight with the back of her hand. She gathered what could be gathered from the cab: a sweater that smelled like cedar, a pair of wool socks, a small tin she did not open. She put them in Evan's bed next to the tarped crates. She tied a clean knot with her good hand and pulled it twice to be sure. Ruby climbed into the passenger seat and fastened the belt with a click that sounded like a decision. She set Star on the dash and watched it turn slowly as light touched the string. The bison's wood caught the sun and held it in the shallow cuts where the knife had gone. Evan eased into the driver's seat and set the crutch along the door. He brought the thermos up and held it out. Mara took a swallow and made a face. The bitterness was honest. She handed it to Ruby, who touched it to her lip and smoothed the thumb over the dent. Mara held the scarf with one hand. The wool held heat like a stone that had sat by a fire. The ends were worn where fingers had worried them. She looked at the pulled thread near the edge and left it alone. "I used to think kneading was the same as owing," she said, not quite looking at him. "It is not." He nodded. He turned the key and the engine started like it wanted to. The vents blew air that warmed quick and smelled like metal going clean. The wipers lifted a lace of frost and sent it to the sides in bright fans. They rolled out of the yard slot with care. The truck climbed the crust and sat on top like a boat finding water. The highway beyond was a ribbon of dull gray with bright margins. Plows had made their passes. A trooper in a parka stood with a flare and clocked each driver with a look that measured. Evan lifted his hand. The trooper did the same. The flare argued orange against the white. The radio voice returned for 2 sentences. Chain control lifted east of town. Keep speeds calm. It felt like someone outside the room had taken a hand from a shoulder and said, "You can go." Mara rested her hand on the envelope and then moved it to the thermos so it could warm the palm that had not been cut. She kept her head high and her eyes moving. Every shadow on the road meant a question, and she answered them in order: bridge, overpass, plow berm, open stretch. Ruby watched the world and then watched them. She leaned to Mara and pressed her arm into wool. She did not say anything. Her body did the saying. They crossed the river where ice hooked along shore and black ran in the middle. The wind made a hand on the cab and then took it away. The truck hummed. The trailer spoke through the hitch in a language Evan knew. He let the sound be a companion. He reached across and touched the back of Mara's wrapped hand with one finger. Just once. A check, not a claim. Her mouth softened. She did not look away from the road. The mile markers began to count themselves right. The sky opened a shade. The world wore its frost like a thin coat instead of an iron plate. The heater found its true temperature. The scarf settled when Ruby leaned her head to it. Star tapped the dash and made a small, hollow knock. The thermos rode easy in its ring. Evan glanced in the mirror and saw the path they wrote closing behind them under drift. Ahead the lane held clean. He did not hurry. He let the line of the road draw them forward. He did not name the feeling in his chest. He let it sit and warm the cold places the night had found. Mara breathed deeper than she had in days. The envelope against her ribs felt like paper again, and not like iron. She counted power poles and found comfort in the way they kept time. She looked at the scarf's blue and thought of water that does not freeze because it moves. She kept her hand near Ruby's. When the girl found it, the fingers laced without needing to ask. They drove into morning that had finally learned how to be bright. The radio cleared long enough to let a song through. It was old and simple, a voice and a guitar recorded in a room where you could hear the chair creak. The sound filled the cab and made a shape that fit. They did not sing. They let the song be another warm thing inside the small space between them. Billings rose slow from the flat, a spread of low roofs and box stores with salt stripes at their base. Plows had pushed the streets into clean lanes that steamed where sun hit. The truck rolled under a blue that finally felt like sky. Evan followed the signs that stacked next to each other until a white building threw back the light, and the big H told him where to pull. Parking lot slush cracked under the tires and left gray fans. The automatic doors opened and breathed heat and disinfectant, and that quiet the body makes when it knows it can stop bracing. Ruby's cheeks went pink in the lobby air. She rubbed them with her gloves and laughed once without sound. The admissions desk had a bowl of pens with flowers taped to the ends. The woman there took names and pressed stickers to plastic bracelets. She looked at the wrap on Mara's hand, and at the way Evan carried weight on one leg and called for triage without looking bored about it. A nurse with a streak of green in her hair checked Ruby first, Cool hand to forehead, small light to eyes, a smile that reached all the way. Temperature normal, lungs clear. Brave kid, she said. Ruby held Star by the string and made the bison nod like it agreed. They moved to a small room where the paint had a scuff at knee height, and a poster described hand washing with pictures. A physician came in with sleeves shoved up and a winter's beard trimmed neat. He unwrapped Mara's gauze and tipped his head to see the line across the palm. He asked how long, how cut, how cleaned. He did not flinch at the truth in her answers. He rinsed, irrigated, laid a dressing in one smooth piece wrapped clean and even, and drew a line along her wrist with a marker where the red sat. Oral antibiotics, he said, voice practical. Keep it dry, move the fingers gentle, come back if the heat climbs past here. He pressed a script into her good hand and did the same work on Evan's ankle with new words. Sprain not break, swell like a small storm, rest if you can. He wrapped and laced a brace and fitted crutches, then watched Evan move 3 steps to see how the body negotiated with pain and pride. Good, he said. Careful. They sat a minute when it was done. The navy scarf lay over Mara's knees. The red thermos stood on the counter next to a box of gloves. Evan poured a cap into the lid and let the steam rise. He handed it to her. She cupped it but did not drink yet. The room smelled like alcohol swabs and coffee fighting to be coffee. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Ruby swung her legs off the vinyl chair eel taps, soft and regular, then stilled them when she remembered where they were. She looked at the chapel sign that pointed down the hall, and then at them, and said nothing. They left with a little paper bag that rattled with the pill bottle and a stapled sheet with instructions that did not sound like scolding. The air outside touched their faces with cold that felt familiar again. The sun slid to the edge of the hospital roof and threw long needles across the lot. On the second floor of a low office building near a pharmacy, a suite with a glass door had a name in vinyl and the word title under it. The receptionist wore wool and smiled with the tired of someone who had worked through more than one snow day. Papers moved from one desk to another with the sound of paper always makes. A notary stamp thumped like a heartbeat. Mara sat at a small table with a jar of pens that had lost their caps. The envelope opened under her hands and gave up its weight. Deed, claim, proofs. A photocopy of her license that had creases. Across from her, a couple in their 20s watched with a baby asleep against the woman's chest. The man had a rancher's son locked into the skin at his neck, and hands clean from washing too often in cold water. We can file it in Red Lodge, he said, eyes on the agent. We will run in twice a week. We will do it right. Mara read each page. Her finger traced lines she had learned on a tired kitchen table months ago. Conditional transfer, payment on delivery. She paused at her brother's name and pressed her mouth flat. Then she signed where the yellow flags asked for it. The notary checked the license photo and the face in front of her and pressed the stamp. The sound landed solid. The man counted cash in slow stacks 20s and 10s that looked like they had been folded and unfolded many times. He slid the money across the table. 200. The bills were warm from his pocket. Mara placed them in a new envelope and tucked it inside her coat under the scarf. The woman with the baby touched Mara's wrist with 2 fingers light, as if asking permission to hope for her. Thank you, the woman said. Her voice was a winter morning. Mara nodded. She turned the empty manila envelope over in her hands, once then left it on the table. She walked down the stairwell with the new weight under her coat and a steady step that surprised her. They crossed to the hospital again because the sign with the H was easy to follow, and the chapel sat just off the lobby, a small room with stained glass that made the winter light look like honey. A chaplain with a kind face and a cardigan the color of moss looked up from a ledger. He did not ask for a story or a fee. He asked for names. Evan Carver, he said. Mara Quinn. He nodded and set a small book on the lectern and touched the page with his thumb. Ruby stood between them, with the navy scarf gathered in both hands like a ribbon. She held very still eyes on their faces, breath shallow with the kind of joy that tries not to make noise in a quiet place. Do you take this woman? The chaplain asked. Evan looked at Mara and saw the mark of the pen along her wrist under clean gauze and the strength of her jaw that had learned to unlock. Every part of him said yes, and the word came steady. I do. Do you take this man? Mara looked at his hands, at the knuckles nicked from work, at the brace hidden by his jeans, at the way his eyes did not look away when things got hard. She felt the scarf against her skin and the heat it had kept. I do, she said. They had no rings worth the name. The chaplain lifted a box from a drawer and found 2 simple bands and a felt slot donations from someone who had brought too many or left one behind. He held them out, and each took one. The metal was warm from his palm. Evan slid the narrow ring onto Mara's finger, awkward with one hand, but sure. It clicked past the knuckle. She slid the other onto his. It fit like it had waited. The chaplain spoke words that had been spoken in 1,000 rooms. He made them small enough to fit this one. He closed the book and smiled without being soft. "By the authority given me," he said, "I pronounce you married." Evan bent and kissed her gentle. Ruby clapped the sound sharp as a bird call in winter. The chaplain shook Evan's hand and then Mara's and pressed a paper into their fingers that would file where papers file. He gave Ruby a peppermint from a dish and told her to keep being brave. Outside, the cold had deepened, and the shadows at the base of the building had filled in. Evan unscrewed the thermos and let the steam rope into the air. He poured into the enamel mugs and handed one to Mara and one to Ruby with both hands. They stood near the line where the pavement met the snow berm and watched their breath become part of the white. "Not because you need a shield," Evan said, eyes on the rim of his cup. "Because I choose you. Not because I owe," Mara said. "Because I want to be here." They drank, and the coffee had gone past good into true again. The cups warmed their hands. The scarf wrapped both their shoulders for a moment, while Ruby leaned against them and looked up. Star knocked against her jacket with a sound that could have been a small bell if someone listened hard. They climbed back into the truck when the cold reached their ankles and bit. The heater started slow and then found its heat. The paper with the chaplain's seal rode safe in the visor. The notary stamp sat neat on the copy in Mara's coat. The city lights came on and rose and made beads of gold that reached toward the highway. In the rear view, the hospital glass held a square of the winter sky and let it go. The engine settled into a hum that fit the day. The road waited with its clean lanes and the truck moved as if it knew the way. The valley opened like a bowl glazed in white. Cottonwoods stood black along a frozen creek. A corrugated roof caught the sun and flashed once before a cloud slid across. Evan idled at the end of a rutted lane and watched powder blow from the fence rails in little ghosts. The place was a rectangle of weathered boards with a stovepipe and a porch that listed toward the east. Someone had left a horseshoe nailed over the door. It wore rust-like freckles. He turned the key and the engine ticked as heat left metal. Air bit their faces when they climbed out. Boots found a crust and broke it. Inside smelled like sawdust and mouse and old rain. A window on the south wall caught whatever light the day gave and spread it thin. Evan tapped the floor with his heel and found the joists by ear. He stood in the center of the room and saw where a table would go, where a bed would make sense, where a shelf could catch the sun. They worked. He chalked lines and cut them true. Ruby carried off lengths of trim under both arms, proud of the weight. Mara opened the door to the stove and found a nest of ash that remembered heat. She built a small fire and fed it slow until the stovepipe warmed and the room shed its edge. The first cup from the thermos tasted like a promise kept. By noon, sawdust hung in light like snow that did not melt. Evan set a rough plank across sawhorses and planed the edge until shavings curled and fell. His brace under the jeans kept the ankle steady. Each pass made a sound that eased him. He called for a square. Ruby set it in his palm without looking away from what his hands did. Mara stood at the window with her bandaged hand on the frame and watched the smoke climb straight up into a sky that had learned how to be blue. In the afternoon, she stepped into the little yard and brushed snow from a raised bed someone had built seasons ago. The soil under the top crust held a little give. She knelt. Her breath made clouds that drifted and faded. From a pocket, she took a handful of garlic heads she had bought in town, split into cloves that smelled like earth and sharp sweetness. She pressed them into the dark and covered them with straw, her fingers careful. Ruby stood close and tucked in the last piece. The sound of straw was a hush. They spread a sheet of plastic over the bed and weighted the corners with stones from under the porch. The radio on the shelf by the window found a station when she turned the dial slow. Static fell away. A man with a soft voice named the local temperature and read birthdays from a list. He played something old with upright bass and a trumpet and a brush on a snare. The sound filled what the fire did not. Near dusk, a truck came up the lane and crunched to a stop. A man climbed down with a narrow face and big hands. A woman followed her coat, open cheeks red, a loaf wrapped in a towel in her arms. A small boy hung back and stared around at everything. "You must be the Carvers," the man said. "Johnson 3 miles south. Heard you made it through that blow." "We did," Evan said. The woman put the bread in Mara's hands and looked at the bandage, and then at her eyes, not the wrap. The steam soaked the towel and rose into the room like a living thing. "Brought you some wire, too," the man added, holding a coil like a gift from a hardware store god. "If you are staying, you will need it." Mara smiled with the small muscles first, and then the larger ones. "We are staying," she said. They stood around the stove and talked about fence lines, and the way the wind throws drifts where the ground looks flat. The Johnson boy touched the bison on its string with one finger, and Ruby let him, then lifted the thermos lid and breathed the coffee steam like it was a secret. The woman looked around the room and nodded to herself as if the walls had set their shoulders and lifted an inch. "Neighbor is a good word around here," the man said. "Barn raising next month. Bring a hammer." "We have hammers," Evan said. "Gish," Evan said. After they left, snow came down lazy and soft. Mara strung a short line of lights the Johnsons had left across the window. The glow made a pool on the table Evan had put together from 2 planed boards he found in the shed. She sat with the navy scarf in her lap and a needle threaded with strong cotton. The wool had one pulled thread near the edge where time had worn it. She stitched a small pattern along the border. Squares inside squares, then a line that turned into a small river if you held it far enough away. Under the river, she added 3 short bars of color from a packet she found at the bottom of a tote. The blue in the old wool made the new work sit easy. Evan watched from the chair he had dragged to the stove. Ruby slept on a quilt on the floor, mouth open, one hand on Star, the other on the scarf where it lay across her. He could hear the little whistle at the back of her throat that came when she was deep in rest. The sound loosened him. "Lena would have liked that," he said, voice low. Mara looked up, then back to the needle. "You think so?" He did not look away. "I know." She set the scarf by the chair and the needle in a pincushion that looked like a tomato. The stitches were neat. The new rested beside the old like pages in the same book. They ate at the new table. Bread with a crust that crackled, cheese that softened near the stove, apples cut into moons, coffee in the enamel mugs that still held heat at the lip. The room found its sound a mixture of stove breath and wood settling, and the radio playing a song that made the window glass vibrate a little on low notes. Outside, wind carried small snow across the yard and drew lines that looked like writing a person could almost read. Mara stepped to the door and opened it just enough to feel night. Cold reached in and touched her cheeks. Stars had found their places with no hurry. Breath lifted and went invisible. She closed the door and set the latch. The click felt right in the hand. She went to Ruby and brushed hair from the child's forehead with the back of her fingers. The skin was cool and soft. The bison's ear caught her nail, and she set it right. Ruby did not wake. The quilt rose and fell in a slow hill. Evan rubbed oil into the tabletop, where a knot had tried to argue. The wood took the shine and gave it back. His hands smelled like pine and soap. He moved the mug and left a ring that warmed the grain before it vanished. He did it again and laughed at himself for liking the way it looked. Mara picked up the scarf and hung it on a peg by the door. The stitches caught a thread of lamplight and held it. 2 hands had worked the wool. She did not say the thought that came with that. She did not need to. The radio found a station out of somewhere flat and far that played a blues that did not hurry. A trumpet bent a note and held it until it felt like it might split, then let it slide back into the cord. The stove ticked. Snow brushed the window in soft fists that left no mark. The thermos stood on the shelf, dent turned outward, warm to the touch. Mara slid onto the bench beside Evan. He took her hand and laid it on his knee under the table palm. Down, fingers relaxed. The room carried their breath like a quiet engine. They did not fill it with talk. Ruby shifted and made a sound that could have been a question if she had been awake. Mara answered with a soft word that meant only that someone had heard. Evan leaned his head back and closed his eyes and let the warmth go all the way to the last cold places. Later, when the fire had settled into a bed of red, he lifted Ruby and set her on the built platform they had given the name loft, even though it was barely above the window. She curled around the bison and the scarf edge and the blanket he had found in a trunk. He tucked it in at her shoulder, one fold just so. Mara washed the enamel mugs with hot water from the kettle and set them upside down on a clean towel. She dried her hands on the leg of her jeans and felt the ridges of stitches under her fingertips through the wool. She touched the radio dial and left it where the trumpet could be heard, like a conversation in the next room. They sat by the stove with their knees almost touching and listened to the building talk itself into night. The door fit tight. The window held. Snow fell. The valley outside lay white and quiet. Inside, the air was warm enough that breath did not show. The scarf on the peg kept its shape. The thermos glowed a dull red where it caught the light. The radio found the space between stations and filled it with something that felt like home. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.